Welcome to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here today. In this Explainer, we are diving right into a comprehensive overview of Chapter 9, focusing entirely on structural family counseling. Now, usually when we think of a family, we picture a group of people bound by blood, affection, or shared history. But today, I want you to completely shift your perspective. We're going to look at the family not just as a collection of individuals, but as a living, breathing piece of architecture. Just like a house has a foundation, load-bearing walls, and a very specific layout that dictates how you move through it, families have this underlying invisible structure that dictates how they function. When that structure is sound, everyone thrives. But when it's off balance, well, that's when things start to crack.
So, here is our literal blueprint for today's session. We'll be looking at 1. The origins of structural counseling, 2. The family architecture, 3. The structural toolkit, 4. Mapping family boundaries, and finally 5. Decoding family dynamics. And this highly organized approach perfectly mirrors the structural counseling philosophy we're about to unpack.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the origins of structural counseling, because every great architectural method has to start with a solid foundation.
To truly grasp this entirely new way of looking at families, we really need to know exactly where and how it was built. And spoiler alert, it didn't start in some pristine, quiet clinic. It started right in the trenches. Back in the early 1960s, a true pioneer named Salvador Minuchin was doing research, training, and counseling at the Wiltwyck School in New York. Now, he was working specifically with delinquent boys who came from poor families, and he quickly realized that traditional individual therapy, it just wasn't cutting it here. He knew he had to look at the actual organization of the families these boys were returning to. So, as we move down the timeline into the 1970s, Minuchin and his colleagues took this foundational work over to the Philadelphia Child Guidance Clinic, and that is really where the theory and practice of structural counseling begins to absolutely flourish and take its modern shape. Finally, in 1974, Minuchin publishes his seminal book, Families and Family Therapy, officially cementing his focus on the interactions of family members to understand the family's overall organization. Moving right along to Section 2, the family architecture. Let's dig into the core philosophy that makes this approach so revolutionary.
We've established the history, but what's the actual theory behind all this? Well, the crucial point is perfectly captured in this quote from Salvador Minuchin. It says, "When the structure of the family group is transformed, the positions of members in that group are altered accordingly. As a result, each individual experiences change." I want you to really let that sink in for a second, because it is the absolute heart of structural counseling. It's this profound trickle-down effect. The counselor's primary target is not the individual's internal psyche, it's the organization of the family itself. We don't just fix the person, right? We remodel the structure they live in. And because the individual is inextricably linked to their position within that family group, when the structure gets fixed, the individual naturally experiences change.
Okay, so that brings us to Section 3, the structural toolkit. How in the world does a counselor actually go about remodeling a family structure?
I mean, it sounds incredible in theory, right? But practically speaking, you can't just take a sledgehammer to people's relationships. To do this, counselors have a really diverse, powerful list of clinical interventions. Think of these as the highly specialized tools a master builder uses to initiate change. The counselor has to start by joining and accommodating the family, essentially getting their foot in the door and building a solid foundation of trust. Then they use tools like tracking sequences and enactments. And enactments literally mean having the family argue or interact right there in the therapy room so the counselor can observe the real dynamics in action. From there, the counselor might use intensifying to heighten a moment, boundary making to separate family members who are just a bit too close, or reframing to completely change how a problem is viewed. They might even be straight up issuing directives. It is an incredibly active, dynamic process. And all of these techniques are ultimately aimed at our next big concept, restructuring. But wait, to restructure, you first need a MAC.
Which perfectly sets up Section 4, mapping family boundaries. Let's literally roll out those blueprints and take a look.
So what exactly is family mapping? Well, let's establish a clear definition. It's a specialized method developed by Minuchin to visually diagram a family structure, their boundaries, and their transactional styles. The beauty of this mapping process is that it takes incredibly abstract, messy, complicated family dynamics and translates them into a concrete, readable diagram that a counselor can actually study. It highlights exactly what the interpersonal relationships look like right there on paper.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what we're talking about. I'm going to act as your guide here for a second and teach you how to read this kind of secret language. Notice the visual shorthand used to map boundaries between family members, say between a mother and a child. Look closely at those lines. A solid, unbroken line, that represents a rigid boundary. A dashed line represents a clear boundary, and a dotted line represents a diffuse boundary. These aren't just arbitrary drawing choices, guys. They represent how flexible or inflexible the connections are within the family system.
Let's contrast the two extremes to really understand what's at stake here. On one side, we have rigid boundaries. You can compare rigid boundaries to a house built with thick, impenetrable concrete walls. In a family, this heavily correlates with disengagement. Members are isolated, there's a lack of support, and communication just cannot easily pass through. Now, on the completely opposite end, we have diffuse boundaries. Think of this as a house with absolutely no internal walls whatsoever. Everyone is just in everyone else's space. In counseling terms, this correlates with enmeshment. Family members are overly involved in each other's business, which completely stunts individual growth and independence. The healthy middle ground, of course, is that clear, dashed line. Doors that can open and close when they actually need to.
All right, moving into our final part, Section 5, Decoding Family Dynamics, because a blueprint doesn't just show you where the walls are.
If you look closely, it shows you how the electricity, the energy, and the tension flow through the entire house. Now, I know these symbols might look a bit like complex algebra at first glance, but they actually map out the emotional wiring of a family. Minuchin and his colleagues developed these specific symbols to track consistent patterns of interpersonal contact and emotional responses. By using distinct visual markers like parallel lines, intersecting strokes, and specific brackets, a counselor can literally chart out where there is over-involvement, where there are coalitions forming against other members, where intense conflict lives, and where tension is being detoured. For example, our sources mention a specific symbol used for mapping out the scapegoating of a child by two parents who are actually in conflict with each other. By getting all of this down on a map, the hidden alliances and the hidden tensions become undeniably visible.
Which brings us right back to the ultimate goal of everything we've discussed today, restructuring. The entire purpose behind uncovering the history, using that diverse toolkit, and drawing this complex family maps filled with dashed lines and emotional symbols is to safely restructure the family. The counselor steps in to actively strengthen those diffuse, overly enmeshed boundaries, basically building some healthy walls, and to soften those rigid, disengaged boundaries, knocking a few doors into those thick walls so the family can actually connect again. It is all about making the family's architecture livable, functional, and healthy once more.
So I want to leave you with something to really reflect on as we wrap up this explainer. Take a moment and look inward at your own family architecture. If Salvador Minuchin or a modern structural counselor sat down and mapped your family dynamics today, right at this very moment, what kind of boundaries would they draw? Would they be using solid lines, dashed lines, or dotted lines? It's a pretty fascinating lens to view our own lives through, isn't it? Thank you so much for joining me today. I really hope this provided a clear, foundational understanding of the structure that holds families together. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I will see you in the next explainer.